Welcome to the Korean Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Laurel Kendall. Laurel is the curator of Asian ethnology and division chair of anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History. She is also a professor of anthropology at the Richard Geller Graduate School. Now, a significant part of Laurel's anthropological work has been with Korean shamanism. And this dates back decades to the 1970s, when Laurel first arrived in South Korea. But this was, of course, a very different South Korea to what it is today. This was a South Korea on the cusp of dramatic change. The old rural agricultural life was being torn away, and Korea's economic miracle was just around the corner. And huge demographic and social shifts were reflected in this dynamic. One of those shifting elements was Korean shamans. Now, just as with the rest of society, this ancient religion was being forced into unexpected changes at this time. Whereas people would once come to shamans in search of ceremonies for their dead ancestors and to address health concerns inside the family, suddenly people were turning up with economic concerns and hopes for professional advancement. Lauren's fieldwork picked up on an anxious society, a society of new economically insecure entrepreneurs, people that were just trying to find a place in a very unstable marketplace. And with the challenges and unpredictability of every market, many people turned back to what they knew. They turned back to Korean shamans for supernatural help, to try and get a leg up on the competition. If they pleased the right gods with the right offerings, these gods would reciprocate in kind. And whereas most of the economic worries in Korea at this time would have been isolated to the newly emerging entrepreneurial class after the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s and the imposition of IMF reforms on South Korea, the entire society was suddenly feeling the same insecurity, the same burden that these people felt throughout. And so Korean shamanism found a place guiding the disenfranchised, the worried, and the ambitious through these unpredictable periods. But shamanism has done more for South Korea. It has helped to break some of the patriarchal control that is still held over from Confucianism. And it gives us an insight into a Korean society and the psychology of the place of religion in people's lives. It breaks old modes of thought where people once believed that religion was for the underclasses, the less educated, the superstitious. But shamanism has found a place across the whole spectrum of Korean society, from top to bottom. And in a time of high-risk capitalism, it has given people an important link to the past, something they can call back on and find an identity in a modern, changing, uncertain world. Throughout Laurel Kendall's fieldwork is a series of fascinating stories and interactions with shamans and the clientele of shamans. She attends rituals, she interviews these people, and she brings across a very clear insight into the dynamism of modern Korean shamans. As always, this podcast is completely funded by you, the listeners, and it does come at some time and cost to run. So if you enjoy the podcast, please consider donating at the Patreon link below, www.patreon.com/Jed Lea-Henry. And of course, if you don't want to donate or you can't afford to, please consider sharing this link instead. So, without any further delay, this is Laurel Kendall. Laurel Kendall, welcome to the Korean Now podcast.
Thank you, and very happy to be here.
Great. So we're going to dig into a lot of the work that you did, dating back over 30 years now with Korean shamanism. But just to plant a flag post here, just for people that are listening, what is Korean shamanism?
Okay, what is Korean shamanism? Well, first of all, I don't like the ism in the word shamanism. What are Korean shamans? What is Korean shaman practice? What is the work that shamans do? First off, what are shamans? Who are shamans? And there are a bunch of definitions flapping around. I use a very, very basic definition. I go back to the Russian ethnologist S.I. Shirokogorov, who described shamans as masters of the spirits. Shamans are people who engage the energies, the spirits, the deities, the ancestors, the animal powers, the whatever that's out there, and bring it into the here and now, make its workings legible to people in the here and now through the medium of their own bodies, sometimes by what seems like an incarnation, sometimes by what seems like intuiting dreams, visions, feelings, but the skill of the shaman is to make the out there present, and to make the out there present in a way that is satisfactory in their view to the what's out there. In the case of Korean shamans, if you think that the classic shaman is, say, a Siberian shaman who goes off on a soul quest and battles with animal forces, flies like an eagle, runs like a deer, fights with fanged animals, and is a shape changer into animal forms, you don't find that in Korea. Korea has historically, like much of East and Southeast Asia, been a state society for centuries, for millennia. And power comes dressed in the trappings of kings and courtiers and generals and court ladies. It's a very different kind of taking on of spirit powers. The spirit powers act like greedy officials. They act like royalty. That is how historically Koreans have understood power. You find similar things in shamanic traditions in the lowland courtly societies of Southeast Asia. You find intimations of similar kinds of shamanic practice in ancient China.
So on that, I suppose a second point of interest here that we have to touch upon, just how did you come to this topic? Because, of course, you came to this in the late 1970s, I believe. So how was it that you came to the topic of Korean shamans?
Okay, I came to it as an anthropologist in 1976, but I had been introduced to the subject as a Peace Corps volunteer in the early 70s. I went to Korea as a graduate from Berkeley, as a product of first wave feminism and campus radicalism, and I found South Korea rather challenging, particularly challenging to be a woman. I was told this is a Confucian society. Man is respected and woman abased, and if you want to be an anthropologist, you need to learn to think like the people you want to study. Well, that was a challenge, and then one day, friends of mine took me to a shaman ritual, and the Korean world as I had known it up to that moment was turned upside down, because in that, the shaman was a woman. Most shamans in Korea are women. She was a woman dressed in a spectacular costume, bright red silk, and she was speaking with the authority of the gods. And those around her, those interacting with the gods, and sometimes even arguing with the gods, were also women. The men were huddling in the corner. And at one point, the deity, an imperious general, stalked over to the corner, seized the master of the house by the ear, pulled him into the center of the action, and began to berate him. My Korean wasn't good enough quite at the time to know what she was saying, but I knew that he was getting the short end of the conversation. And I said to myself, I can study this. My gender will not be a disadvantage. My gender will, in fact, be an advantage. And I also, when I went back to graduate school, wanting to know how it was that Korean women got away with this, how there could be female shamans in this overtly Confucian, overtly male-dominant society. It was a very good time to be posing those questions, because in the early 70s, we were inventing what we came to call the anthropology of women. We would later call it the anthropology of gender. We were exploring how a society looked different when women and women's perspectives and women's activities were factored in. And it was on the strength of that that I went back to Korea as an anthropologist, armed with questions to try and understand how shamans fit into Korean life, how it was that shamans and women transacted with gods. And I came to conclude that it was a complementary domain of Korean life. Men were in the ritual activities of men, they were concerned with faith and the maintenance of faith. They took care of the ancestors in a very idealized way. They were filial sons, taking care of virtuous fathers and grandfathers. On the women's side, things go wrong. People get sick. Financial difficulties erupt. Children become obstreperous. Children take up with partners that the parents don't like. All of this stuff gets brought to the shaman, and it gets enacted as a kind of psychodrama where all the family's problems are aired. The ancestors appear and they weep, these known dead. People cry together, people laugh together, and when it's all over, they feel very purged. So what women are doing are re-establishing the harmony that's essential to the presentation of a harmonious household, a presentation of that household, that family, to the world, to the larger community.
So are you saying there that it's not only most of the shamans women, but in fact it's mostly women that are coming to the shamans themselves? And also on that...
It's women.
Yes. And also on that question, how is it, as you said, it's of course a change in society, but Korea has a lot of Confucian hangovers. How is it that, as that image you portrayed there of this woman haranguing this man, how is that power dynamic managed to shift in this particular area of Korean society?
Okay, well, all right, that's a complex and multi-layered question. All right, the first part, how are shamans, is it women who go to shamans? Yes, traditionally it has been women who go to shamans. And it's a particular category of women usually. I mean, anyone can go to a shaman, but most often it's the woman who is the most responsible matron of the house. When I started doing field work in the Korean countryside, these were often multi-generational households. You would have a mother-in-law, a daughter-in-law, and then growing children. And if the mother-in-law was still the active manager, she would be the one who would take the initiative for going to the shaman. If she had retired that responsibility, it would be the daughter-in-law who would take the lead. But in those days, in the 70s, South Korea, particularly village South Korea, was a much more collective place. So women might go together, mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, sister-in-law, mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, married out daughter. And they might, if the problem was seen as involving some collective ancestral entity, a couple of households, related households, might contribute to the sponsoring of a ritual. But I'm getting ahead of myself because the first thing they would do is get a diagnosis. The shaman would do a divination. And she would ask them questions. Is there someone who's wandered far from home? Is there someone who's committing adultery? And then she would start building a diagnosis about the family situation. And, there are two possibilities here. This might be the shaman that the woman of the house has been going to for many years. And the shaman knows a great deal about that household, and they have a give and take, joking relationship. And she takes the shaman's diagnosis, and then she says usually, well, I have to go back home. I have to see what the old people say about it. I have to think about it. And then if she feels that the shaman's diagnosis is correct, because the shaman has probably recommended a very expensive ritual, she'll come back with the money and they'll do the major ritual, the kut, where the gods come back and talk and play and drink and dance, and the people would drink and dance. If she's a new client, she might have gone to a couple of shamans, and she would be asking, are you, she would be trying to get a sense of how astute the shaman was, whether what the shaman was telling her was clear and sharp, which would mean that the shaman's own spirits are helping her, are favoring her with strong visions. This is a shaman who's really got a line to the gods and the ancestors. This is a shaman who can do an effective cure. This is a shaman who's given an accurate diagnosis. And she would still probably say, I've got to go think about it. I've got to go talk to the old people and see what they say. But if she were convinced, if she received a compelling diagnosis, she would come back and there would be a kut. And if she felt that in some respects the outcome was auspicious, the problem had resolved itself, life was better, she might then become a regular client, a groupie of that particular shaman. Now, what I'm describing is very much a part of an older Korea, a village Korea. It's a bit different now. What you see now is it's much, much more privatized. Women's knowledge of shamans, often it comes from superstar shaman performances that they may have seen on television. They haven't seen it in their neighborhoods. Most of them don't live in villages anymore. The South Korean population is no longer rural except for a very, very tiny minority. And so it's much more chancy. It's much more word of mouth. A woman's having trouble and her neighbor says, my sister-in-law went to such and such a shaman. And the woman goes, but she doesn't know what the grannies in the neighborhood think of that particular shaman. And when she has her ritual done, in the days when I was doing my first field work in the 70s, it was like a big party. The neighbors were there. The relatives were there, people were there to observe the shaman, to comment on the shaman's ability, and to join the clients in engaging the gods and the ancestors. What you see now is the client is whisked off very privately to a shrine in the mountains where in commercial space the ritual is enacted. And so there's no community to judge whether this is an effective ritual, and there's no community to really cheer the client on. It's a much less communal experience. It's a much less, it's shorter, and what can I say? It's different. It's a different kind of thing. It's much more, I hate to use this word, but I would say it's much more commoditized.
Sure. So on that point of commoditization, let's come into some of your field work. And you began to look at Korean shamanism at a very interesting time within South Korea itself. So whereas once these shaman rituals were often around health and things like this, you began to notice a shift in trend where shamans would often speak about how their clients were coming to them with preoccupations about wealth and advancement in their careers.
Yes, what I began to see was both a concern with wealth, because South Korea everybody in South Korea has experienced a rising material horizon. Some people feel that it's rising, but maybe it's rising faster for people around them than it's rising for them. The economy was also ramped up to incredible risk. We saw this in the Asian financial crisis at the end of the 90s, but it was happening in small ways to smaller enterprises much, much earlier. And I began to notice in my interactions, in the things people told me, both that their clients were doing rituals because they wanted to make lots of money, but also because they feared sudden, devastating bankruptcy, that this was also going on all around them. So I went back to Korea, and I was systematic. I went around to a lot of these private shrines in the mountains, and I asked permission to watch the ritual. And I didn't simply ask, why are you holding this ritual? I would get a simple answer like, my leg hurts. But I would watch the ritual and watch the interaction and hear what the gods were saying and hear what the clients were saying. And then a longer story began to unfold, which the clients themselves would begin to share with me. And it might be the woman's leg hurts because she's worrying desperately about a financial arrangement where a shipment is delayed, and because the shipment's delayed, then she might fall into deep debt with loans. A whole precarious card house of credit might come tumbling down. She might lose her business. In that summer, most of the kut that I observed, at the core, there was a business concern, and every kut that I observed, there were prayers for the success of some, petit bourgeois, some small entrepreneurial enterprise. What I didn't see in that first summer of 1994 was the white collar. The white collar was fairly noticeably absent, and that made sense because the white collar employees, the employees of the chaebol, the large corporations, that was considered safe, secure employment, and they're not being shaken by the kinds of things that sent people, anxious people, to shamans. What I did encounter in at least one instance was a family where the husband had lost his job. He was a former white-collar employee, and it was his wife who was pulling the family along with a florist business, and the business was in trouble. When I went back after the Asian financial crisis, it was quite different. Suddenly the white collar was there in the shaman shrines because their world had been profoundly shaken. There were people who had recently lost their jobs. There were people who were afraid that they were going to lose their jobs. There were people who had it in for people who they saw as being instrumental in their losing jobs. It was a very, very anxious time. And that was reflected in the expanded profile of the shaman's clientele.
So on that, let's just touch into what happened in the Asian financial crisis, because we're going to keep coming back to this. So you represented a very interesting change there. The idea that previously not all the risk, but the majority of the risk inside the developing Korea was done by these lower entrepreneurs, this developing class, because the upper chaebols, these large conglomerates, were largely sponsored and were given monopolies by the government themselves. So if the Asian financial kicks in towards the late 90s and Korea effectively goes bankrupt, the IMF has to come in and help it out, and the whole society is suddenly in the same position of job insecurity and financial insecurity.
Absolutely, well said. And many of the people who either were inside the chaebols or were aspiring to suddenly find themselves looking to do small entrepreneurial enterprises. Restaurants are very risky. I live in New York City, and restaurants are always opening and closing. But if you have a relatively small amount of capital but a certain amount of labor, family labor, that's one thing you turn to. And there was a flowering of small restaurants and also franchise employment in South Korea at that time.
So I suppose it's important to ask here, just how did the shamans themselves feel about this change in dynamic of their employment, effectively? So how did you have people asking them, instead about properly sending off their ancestors or dealing with health crises in their family, instead of asking about things like material gain, how did they cope with this change? How did they approach it?
Okay, in terms of material gain, I think they had been feeling throughout the period that I had been doing this research that was something the gods could help them with. What happens in a kut, the dynamics are you open your gates of good fortune and good things pour in. And it was very easy to adapt the language, the dynamics of a kut, the characterizations of gods who were considered already very greedy, and some of them became very quickly identified with financial concerns and aiding people in finance. The client has a huge appetite, the client is greedy, hungry, and the god is greedy and hungry, and the god might tell the client, your greed is even greater than my own. And people laugh because it refers to the god, and maybe, just maybe, it also refers to the shaman, and there's some winking and nodding. But the IMF was a challenge. The IMF was something they perceived as this enormous force, this big black hand in the sky that had clamped down on Korea. And the shamans and their deities, they can help you at the level of a household. They can maybe help you at the level of a village. And they can go out, the super shamans, the superstars, and do, and offer prayers on behalf of the Korean nation. But shamans were saying things like, I can't help change the economy. I don't even understand the economy. The IMF is bigger than I am. The IMF is sort of almost like the way they perceive the operation of fate. that if you're born in an unlucky hour and an unlucky day, that's bigger than them. They can do rituals for you to maybe mediate the fact that you've been dealt a really bad hand in life, but they can't fundamentally change the fact that you're somebody who's going to suffer a lot. And ditto, they saw the IMF as something so much bigger than they were. They could do a little bit to help people, to give them a sense of optimism as they engage the world, maybe prevent them from the worst swings of misfortune. But the IMF was far, far bigger than they were, and they recognized that very articulately.
So there's a point that keeps coming up in some of your writings that I keep seeing here, and I suppose this, at least in Korea, doesn't have that too much of a distant history. This idea of nobility, and you touch on it a few times, and you have a lot of anecdotes of people saying to you and saying to shamans, etc., the idea that to be noble in Korea, to achieve nobility, all you need is money. This idea of acquiring money and moving up within nobility, it changes the social dynamic.
Yes, this was a profound change in the stories Koreans tell about themselves. Traditionally, in South Korean society, the Yangban, the nobles, they were privileged by birth, and they were privileged by the ownership of land, but they were a class that defined itself by non-labor. They were people who had other people till the land for them. They were people who were also supposed to disdain commerce. People who engaged in commerce by the old East Asian scheme were really very low class. The merchant was despised. The merchant might laugh through his silken sleeve at them, but the merchant was despised. And in South Korean society today, you will find people who, for example, are in the white collar or are in academia or are in the civil service, who make what the Koreans consider a clean living by virtue of their pens or their computers these days, will look down on entrepreneurs, see them as people who are a little bit sordid, a little bit dishonest, because they have to be a little bit corrupt to get by in the world. And so those attitudes persist. That's a persistence of an older idea about commerce. But at the same time, people I talked to who were, lower middle class, aspiring middle class, struggling entrepreneurs, and shamans who were very much in the same boat as the entrepreneurs, were saying these incredibly cynical things about, you just have money these days, and they call you a yangban, they call you nobility. And to a degree, that was true. There is an elite, and that elite maintains itself in terms of, a certain pursuit of lifestyle, a certain pursuit of educational aspiration for their children, by virtue of the money they hold. And it's one of these interesting stories about class formation, class maintenance, class realignment that has happened very dramatically in South Korea. And as in Europe, with, maintaining, drawing on, reconfiguring, appealing to the trappings of an older notion of what it means to be noble, what it means to be elite.
And one of the interesting things that I saw coming up in some of your research is you were witness to a very dynamic time, a very traumatic time as well in Korean village life. So you were in these villages doing this anthropological research, and you were seeing this huge change where the young women, the young men were all leaving the village to find jobs in factories elsewhere, and their parents, in some sense, were following them into this world, were following them into this life as entrepreneurs.
Yes, well, in some ways that happened. In some cases that happened. I think for the young people who went to the factories, we have a lot of ethnography now about how really hard, how really brutal those factories were. But what pulled them and pushed them was that they saw, well, to some degree, initially, for many, it was an adventure. And to some degree, it was also a rejection of the rural way of life, which looked so bucolic when you're an outsider, when you're an anthropologist, but was really a hard way of life. And yes, people were experiencing that, were reconfiguring their lives, and that was going on. That was, the rural-urban transition was very much an activity going on in the 70s, and is pretty much now the reality. Many of the children of these village families have been successful, have ended up living what South Koreans would recognize as a middle-class life. They live in apartments. They have good jobs like civil servants. Which you could do in the 70s generation, even if you hadn't gone to university. That wouldn't be true today, I don't think. Their children go to university. Sometimes their children even study abroad for a bit. It's a totally different world, but it's also a much less communal world. People live in much greater isolation. Gender is also different. Women aspire to many things that were beyond the reach of their mothers. Professional women abound. Some of the daughters of the granddaughters of the village women of my first field work are, just assume that they've gone to the university and they will have a career, and they've worked hard for it. The world is making it hard for all young Koreans to find jobs because South Korea produces so many college graduates. And that is a struggle that probably shows up in shaman consultations, prayers for children, and so on.
So let's go into an individual story here and make this a bit more personal and get some real intrigue coming here. So in 1991, and a shaman we're supposed to introduce here, Shaman Yongsu's Yongsu, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yongsu's mother, yeah.
Yongsu's mother, and you were there at a ritual of for a new car, honoring a new car, and I suppose honoring the spirits around the new car. And a man had just purchased this car, and he hadn't checked his horoscope beforehand with this shaman. And you note that there's a certain logic. So he had some challenges, and she was saying to him that he purchased it too soon. And you notice that there's a logic here that if you bring new goods, new wealth into the household, that should come with a certain amount of giving to the supernatural officials, to the gods. And if it doesn't, then it throws your life out of harmony and bad things will come your way.
Yes, in the shaman's view, you live in a precarious relationship with your household gods. It's somewhat like your relationship with officialdom. There are powerful people in the world who have some control over your fortune. And if you treat them well, they treat you well. And if you ignore them, they may come down on you. This is an attitude toward officialdom that is very, very old in South Korea, but you find it very much alive and well in people's interactions with authority. So, yes, the wealth had come in. And when wealth comes in a traditional Korean household, you do a ritual called a kosa, where you offer rice cake and wine to the household deities, make them happy, make them share, make them aware that your good fortune, your largesse, is also shared with them and comes back to them in the form of gratitude so that they will continue to make things go well for you. This particular man, this particular story, his mother had been a very loyal client of the shaman Yongsu's mother. And then the man married, and he and his wife became Christians. And then bad things started to happen. They lost their business, they lost their apartment, and then they went back to the shaman, chastened. I'm sure the mother had something to say about this. And they, according to the shaman, they were slowly recouping their fortunes. And he had the resource now to buy a nice, shiny new black car. And then the shaman said, but your horoscope isn't great this year. Bad things can, you're not protected this year. And you've brought in something. In the old days when people brought in an ox or a pig, they would have to make an offering to the household gods. You bring in a car and you have to do another kind of offering. So we will show our gratitude to the household gods. And then for this, we will take care of the official governing the engine of the car and the official governing the car itself, so you don't have accidents. And when it was over and the man drove me to the subway station, he talked very nostalgically about his childhood memories of going to the shaman's house and said he felt so much more at ease and, now that he'd taken care of the household gods and the car. I didn't get his wife's opinion on this, however.
Yep. Another story like that came around, and just in passing here, but you were talking about a man who was forced out of his job in his early 40s or in his 40s, and he was asking the shaman about whether he should join his wife in a business that his wife had set up, and the shaman says gives a certain amount of economic caution. It says wait 2 or 3 years before you completely give up on your career and join your wife. And you mention after this, and I suppose this is interesting, that in your experience the spirits tend to be physically conservative.
Yes, in my experience, that's been the case. The shamans I worked with, and these were women who, were living in a rural environment, and they were living, economically. They were not as privileged as many urban people at the time. And then going forward from the 70s through the 90s, they tended to be very conservative. They tended always to say, wait, don't make the big move yet. It may be different with some of the superstar shamans who have very high roller clients. They may have been giving advice that was a little bolder, but that wasn't the world that I studied.
So just on that for a second, let's move into I suppose a different aspect of this commercial life. You write a lot about the uptick in these commercial shaman shrines. So in the mountains surrounding Seoul, these commercial shrines begin to set up. And you mentioned that at least in part of this has got to do with the fact that the government imposed strict anti-noise ordinances upon society as a deliberate attempt to try and suppress some of the shamans' activity. So they were forced into these mountain shrines.
Yes, that's correct. Well, first of all, urban life is different from village life, and industrial time is different from rural time. And so you do have people living in apartments where if your neighbor's hitting the drum deep into the night, you may have trouble sleeping and you may have trouble getting up early to do your job. But it's also the case that Christians were very enthusiastic about these kinds of legislations as a way of getting the shamans out of the neighborhood, driving the shamans away from public view. And in the government, there was also a strain of anti-superstition, seeing the shamans as something to be embarrassed about, something that you want to keep the lid on. The shamans, for their part, would say, nobody complains about the Christians ringing the bells at all hours because they're a recognized religion. Nobody complains about the Buddhist monks. Nobody would do this kind of thing to Buddhists or to Christians. And that prompted shamans to, in a couple of instances, to try and organize themselves as an organized religion. All of these to date have failed because it's a system that doesn't work like that. It would be like, organizing chiropractors into an organized religion. They're specialists who deal with problems. They're in competition with each other for the skill, the power of their gods, and these attempted coalitions are usually very, very brittle, and they fall apart before they get the body mass that could go forward and demand recognition as an organized religion.
So you mentioned there that there's an element of embarrassment in Korea or trepidation about shamans today. So that's an interesting little segue that we might take right now. And I might ask you about Park Geun-hye and the scandal that came about over her. I suppose it was a corruption scandal, but at least a significant undercurrent of all of this was the shaman links of her friend Chae Sun-sil and her father.
Yes, that, all right. I will say, I've said this to many, many people, there was nothing, Chae Sun-sil was emphatically not a shaman. She was, there is no indication that this woman was a shaman. Her father ran a movement that had religious overtones. Koreans would probably call it a new religion. And some people say, oh, you know, the charisma of the founder is like the charisma of the shaman, but really it has nothing to do with the practice of shamans in South Korea today. To me, what was fascinating and exasperating about the whole Chae Sun-sil incident is that I think in the historical imagination of South Koreans, what was replaying was stories from the dynastic past. In the 18th century, there was a major scandal where queens were listening too much to shamans, and shamans were using sorcery to try and to do in rivals in the court. And there was a trial, and shamans were executed, and there was a popular novel about these activities. Like all witchcraft accusations, there's, absolutely, people confess. They confessed under torture what really happened. But in more recent times, the last queen, Queen Min, she was also a fan of shamans, and she favored shamans who are said to have used their entree with the queen to favor their corrupt relatives. These are stories that are freighted with the idea that you can't trust women, women have no judgment, women easily succumb to things like, sweet-talking shamans who then are completely corrupt and favor their relatives and do all sorts of toxic, noxious things. So that this was a replay in modern dress, when Marx said something like, men make their history, but they don't make it exactly as they wish. It comes dressed in the costumes of the past. And that was what I think was going on here. Not that she was a shaman, but that she played into a historical imaginary where corrupt shamans took advantage of powerful women, and the moral being women shouldn't be powerful.
So on that, we might let's move into a broader question here. That question of the idea of a corrupt shaman is something you touch on in your book as well for a bit here. So the idea of what is the difference here? So for the average person looking in, what is the fundamental difference between how you spot this sort of corrupt shamanism? How does it come about? What sort of nature does it hold inside Korea? How is it looked upon?
How is it looked upon? Well, all shamans are suspect because all religion can be perverted, all religion can be corrupted, all religion can be used instrumentally to improper ends. In the case of shamans, one is being asked to accept that she is correctly interpreting what she gets from the out there and transforms that into the here and now. If you think in ways that people think of as modern, you assume there is no out there, so she must be corrupt in the first instance because she's a purveyor of superstition. She's doing something, she's speaking in the name of something that can't possibly exist. I feel somewhat differently. I feel that the shamans themselves whatever they're sensing, whatever they're feeling, whatever they're saying, do feel very accountable to the spirit world. They describe things that have gone wrong in their own life in by the same logic that they describe things that have gone wrong in their clients' lives, ways that the deities have been offended. And they consider it, that if they don't have an inspiration, that they don't have a dream, that they don't get the message, the burden is still on them to tell it the way the gods want it told. And if they fail, it redounds badly on them, it redounds badly on their clients. In the most basic way, if they don't do an effective ritual and the client is dissatisfied, this is a shaman who loses clients. So there is that sense. Shaman's view of what's going on, uber modern view of what's going on, and then a sense that some shamans fake it completely, some shamans fake it some of the time. All shamans are going to push people in the direction of ritual activity, so you have to be careful. But, sometimes they're acting also with a huge amount of sincerity. Shamans themselves will complain about other shamans. That shaman isn't a real shaman. That shaman always is asking her clients for too much money. That shaman is always overprescribing expensive rituals. It's a world where the balance, the judgments are constantly going on. And I think that's true of any kind of, healing on the basis of faith, healing on the basis of spiritual power, that kind of community, you're likely to find it. Those kinds of suspicions, those kinds of criticisms, and every now and then the feeling that person really has it.
And of course, it feels like a world in which the economic concerns have also shifted into shamanism itself. You mentioned a few times that if you go to these shamans today, they're quite well dressed. The old robes are gone, and now they have these new silk robes. They've got all these wonderful pictures on the walls, and of course the actual offerings that you make to the gods have changed. Where once there were simple rice cakes, increasingly there are things like bottles of whiskey and imported American brand names and things like this.
Yes, there has been, just as there's been a rising horizon of material wealth in South Korea, it's certainly reflected in people's dealings with the spirit world. And of course, even among the shamans themselves, complaints about other shamans whose gods are too greedy and ask for too much and so on. And shamans presenting themselves as people who tell people just bring what you can afford, but the other shamans ask for too much food, too much offering food, too much money, etc., etc. But there is also built in a certain dynamic where, all right, who is a successful shaman? A successful shaman is a shaman whose gods favor her. Her gods bring her clients. Her gods cause her to perform effectively, so her clients are satisfied and they come back and they bring more they bring more clients. Therefore, a shaman is sort of pressured to present herself very well, well-dressed, rings on her fingers, etc. This is a shaman whose gods smile on her. There is also a certain sense in the elaboration of shrines that a shaman, if her gods smile on her and give her good fortune, she should give back some of what she earns back to the deities themselves. So she should have a well-maintained shrine. She should have, very very fancy, up-to-date god pictures and equipment and so on. Show the gods how much she appreciates them. Show the clients how powerful her gods are, that she should be in a position to celebrate them in this way. So that dynamic is there. It may be a pernicious dynamic, but it's definitely there.
And I might get you to talk about another story that I came across, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. This story of I guess it was a late night bar of sorts, and it was run by a young entrepreneur, a young woman.
Uh-huh.
And do you know the story?
I know where you're going. Yes.
Okay. I might get you to pick it up then and fill in the listeners. Yeah.
Okay. So she ran a bar, and she. Let me see if I can remember the details. But she would take. Her client was drunk, and he put down a very large bill on the bar and staggered away into the night. And he came back the next day, and she said, "Sorry, that's what you paid me." And then when the deity who took care of the bar showed up, and was giving her prosperous income, showed up in a ritual, in a kut, asked for the same amount of money. You took it in and I helped you there, so you've got to give it to me, i.e. hand it over to the shaman. And there was much, much humor because the story was shared. I think that's what happened.
Yeah, that's exactly what came out. So how was it that the shaman knew this? Did you ever get to that? It seemed like a very difficult thing to find out.
These were close communities, and if she hadn't heard it directly from the woman herself, she would have heard it, talked about, laughed about among the chain of clients that had ultimately brought the bar girl to her, the bar proprietress to her.
And this is the very funny moment there where she says, "Auntie, how did you ever know this?"
And then she says, "I'm not Auntie. I'm the spirit warrior of the bar."
Yes. So just on that, actually, how was it that you managed to get inside these rituals? Because you mentioned before that there can be a lot of suspicion around certain religious practices. So how was it that a foreigner such as yourself, I imagine, with quite clearly recording what these people are doing, if only writing it down, was allowed into these ceremonies? Because even if the shamans were more than happy to have you there, I imagine some of the people involved were probably telling and talking about things that they may not want to be recorded. So it must have been a sort of a tightrope to walk, I imagine.
Yes, well, it was. I was very lucky. I met the shaman that I call Yongsu's mother, and she is a very, very intelligent woman. And I think she was early in her career. She was putting it all together, and we would have these long conversations, sort of like seminars, where I would ask a question, and unlike the old shamans who had sort of internalized and would give me a kind of regular patter, she would think it through, and she would give me case material, and we would discuss things, and I was kind of a source of amusement. This was a Korea before 24-hour television. And so I would go, she would allow me to sit while she saw her clients and take me to kut with her colleagues. Her colleagues knew me, and then when they were doing a ritual and she was going, I would be invited along, and I got that way to see a great many things, and in addition to just seeing the ritual, to actually hearing the divination sessions, to attending the minor rituals, to watching case histories unfold. She was really my good fortune. When I did research later, back in the 90s, one of the things that helped me was my knowledge of the specialized vocabulary of the shaman world, the order of the kut. I wasn't just going in as a naive observer, and that helped me get into situations where people could talk about things. But I don't think any of this would have been possible without this very fortuitous meeting with my shaman teacher, Yongsu's mother.
And there's a very interesting conclusion that you come through some of your research here, and you're quite explicit in saying this, that it's very important that we don't look at religions in the sense of shamans as the sole occupation of these lower disadvantaged, marginalized peoples, because then we fall into this trap of then saying the higher, the more dominant classes, they're the rational ones, they're the normal ones. But of course, across Korean society, at least at the moment, and back when you were noticing it yourself, shamanism had an influence from top to bottom.
Oh, absolutely, it did. I worked in a village because at that time in the 70s, we still thought of anthropology as something that took place in villages. And it was the village environment that gave me a place where people would talk and gossip and were not so withdrawn as city people were beginning to be. But I knew from some rituals I had seen both as a Peace Corps volunteer and through connections in Seoul that there were some very, very popular shamans who had some very, very elite clients. I did not study in that world. I never felt that I could find the things I wanted to know working in that world. But yes, it goes up and down the social ladder. It always has. Shamans were in and out of the royal court, even when they were supposedly banned from the city of Seoul. Shamans tell stories about the wives of very high chaebol people going and sponsoring rituals. What they complain about is that people who are very high up in society, both in business and in government, that they will hold kut, but they will do it very quietly, because it is somewhat suspect, because it is somewhat looked down on, and that it would be so much more helpful to the shamans, to their esteem, if people were more upfront, these powerful and wealthy people were more upfront about using shamans. The thing that cuts against the superstition image is the way shamans have come now to be regarded as repositories of traditional Korean culture. Some of them are recognized as bearers of intangible cultural heritage, people who carry the songs, the rituals, the traditions that are deeply, deeply Korean. And this has done a great deal for their sense of self-esteem. The fact that they perform on television, they are seen, they're welcomed at folk festivals, and so on. It's also ramped up the competition between them.
Just a couple of last questions here. One of the things that came through, and I begin to at least intuit myself from reading your work, is that there's almost when Koreans go to these shamans, it for many people listening, it may seem like this sort of naive solution, but there's almost a mature approach to capitalism about it, or at least a mature understanding of capitalism about it, in the sense that they understand that the marketplace really is a gamble, that there's an awful lot of luck involved in this, and to be able to just be able to guide your way through it, be able to predict events is really not possible, even if going to the shaman is not the answer.
Absolutely, I'm so glad you saw that. Yes, one of the ultimately in anthropology we say somehow or other people come back to their own roots in the things they look at in distant places. My father was a businessman. And what I could observe of that world was that it was very precarious, and that people who worked very hard sometimes lost out and became disadvantaged. In my father's case, he was fairly lucky, but there were a few times when investments went badly and cautions took, things had to be, belts were a little tighter for a little while. I began to see a profound identification with many of the shamans' clients in their awareness that, as hard as you work, there are so many variables that can cause things to go wrong. All right, the pundits were predicting something like the Asian financial crisis, but nobody knew exactly when it was going to happen, and that would have been the critical knowledge that would have caused some people to save their skins. And at a much smaller scale, you don't know if your creditor is going to call in the loan when you can least afford it, if your debtor is going to default, if somebody's going to abscond with the money from the rotating credit association. all these things that, if the shipment of a certain fashion style you've invested in is suddenly going to be out of fashion. We have metrics. A lot of people spend a lot of time trying to figure it out ahead of time, but it's hard to imagine a market without the X factor, truly, truly. Even in this, this over metricized age that we're living in.
So as a final question here, and it feels like this might be the unifying theme of some of your work here, that the question might come about that why wasn't Korean shamanism left in the past? If it had this rural, ancient links to Korea, why wasn't it left in the past by modernizing Korea? And it feels like, and you've mentioned it quite explicitly a few times, that the important way to understand Korean shamanism, at least today, is as a dynamic popular religion that's shifting and changing itself to suit the times.
Okay, I would say to that precisely because of who shamans are, the people who are taking the message from the out there and translating it into the here and now, and they have to be agile and they have to be perceptive. These are people who are engaging the present, who are bringing a sense of the out there into how people live now. And they've been doing that for a very, very long time, centuries, maybe millennia. And a good shaman is an agile shaman who's responsive to the world around her. So, for me, there's just no question that this is left in the countryside. If people want to romanticize that rural past as a way of saying this is cultural heritage and it's endangered and we should preserve and protect shamans, I'm all for it. Because maybe they need that for the sake of their own esteem. But I see it as a constantly transforming, constantly evolving religious phenomenon. And to the degree that it does that, it will be part of Korean life into the future.
So on that note, we might leave it there.
Okay.
The two works that I've been basing my questions on today are from a 1996 article called Korean Shamans and the Spirit of Capitalism and a 2009 book called Shamans, Nostalgia and the IMF. But of course, you've done an awful lot of other work on shamans, and I will put a link to your work at the bottom of this podcast. So, Laurel Kendall, thanks for coming on the Korean Hour podcast.
Thanks for having me.